Every weekday morning in countless classrooms from Maine to California, American school children perform a curious ritual. They stand from their desks, place their hands over their hearts, and in unison recite a 31-word loyalty oath to a flag. The words of this pledge of allegiance roll off the tongue by rote often before children really fully grasp its meaning. To outside eyes, this scene could resemble the daily devotional of, dare I say it, a cult. A mass inculcation of unquestioning patriotism at the earliest age. And indeed, critics have long argued that the pledge's real purpose is indoctrination. It conditions the young to revere national symbols and accept certain beliefs as sacred and beyond question. This is but one facet of a broader phenomenon. American society exhibits strikingly cult like characteristics in its education system, media messaging, historical mythology, public rituals, and political religious ideology. From the sanitized history in our textbooks to the near religious worship of the flag and the military, from the vilification of dissenters to the gospel of American exceptionalism. The United States often functions less like a free republic of independent thinkers and more like a faith community bound by dogma. And today we are going to probably ruffle a little feathers as we unpack it all. So sit back, relax, and take a deep breath. It's time to let the fresh air in. Hello, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome if you're new. My name is Erin, and I am fascinated by all things cults, true crime, and unique spiritual practices. I drop a big deep dive every single Saturday on a cult, and I might sprinkle in some other videos here and there, maybe go live once in a while. So, if you like this sort of thing, please consider subscribing. I would absolutely love to have you here. But if you're coming back again, thank you so much for your support. Now, before all of the feathers get ruffled, I just want to say that two things can be true at once. You can love your country and the opportunity that it presents to you, and also remain critical of the way it's ran. I think and I believe in any healthy, functioning, especially modern society, we need to hold our leaders accountable and we need to start recognizing all of the weaknesses that our country does possess so that history does not end up repeating itself. I find it incredibly valuable to look back into the history books, determine where we might have gone wrong, and try to figure out a way to make things better as a whole. Now, I am going to be conducting this particular video from a very critical lens. However, this is not any attack on America or fight for it to necessarily change. It's rather a critique of what I've observed based off of some extensive research I have done. Because personally, when I look at the structure of America and certain things that we are kind of forced to do at a young age to kind of put us into this automatic routine, and it's a routine that we kind of start carrying into adulthood. And if you decide to kind of veer off of that path, it can feel very, very difficult, and it feels like other people who really believe in the system want it to make you feel bad. Like, they want to make you feel bad about it. They want to make it feel more difficult for you, so you're forced to kind of jump back on the path. So, I just wanted to give that disclaimer right off the top. I mean, we are freshly off of the 4th of July, which was yesterday, and I know maybe some of y'all are feeling like super patriotic right now. And I just want you to listen to this with a bit of an open mind and consider that America is not as perfect as we have been brought up believing. Now, before we jump into the video, I want to celebrate today's teacher. Now, as a lot of you know, I am sponsoring teachers in each of my videos this month. What's going to happen is I am going to leave their Amazon wish list down in the pinned comment below. And if you have the means or feel generous, please go ahead and purchase one of the items for them. It will be shipped to their house, but you shouldn't be able to see their actual address. It's a really cool function. Today's teacher is Rachel. Rachel says, "Good morning. My name is Rachel, and I am a seventh grade English and language arts teacher in South Carolina. I would like to be considered to be sponsored in one of your videos this month." Well, welcome. You're here. A little bit about me. I've been a teacher in South Carolina for 8 years. I work in a school that has a lot of students in poverty and lots of students from immigrant backgrounds. About a third of our students are served in the special education program, whereas most schools have about 15% of their kids served in special education. Wow, that's a lot. Thank you for all you do. On a statewide scale, we had a lot of challenges as teachers in South Carolina. A bill was passed a couple of years ago that makes it easier for books to be banned and censored, and we're currently leading the nation as the state with the most book bans. I have a master's in library and information science, so this is extra heartbreaking for me. I want to encourage kids to be independent and learn about the world, but I have to be so careful about what I say and what materials I have in my classroom. I've served on a committee at my school that pushed back against book bans at the district level, and we were successful in some cases, but unsuccessful in others. And this is so perfect for today's topic because this is information control. When we ban books because we're worried about what a child is going to learn or be exposed to or might start critically thinking for themselves, that's very problematic in my opinion. Despite these challenges, I really love what I do. Aw, I love pushing kids to be better readers and writers. I love watching them discover new passions and tell me all about it. I love helping them not only academically, but also socially. Middle school is a crazy time and there are hormones all over the place, but it's so meaningful to be a person that gets to take kids through the challenges of life. I appreciate the opportunity to be considered. Sincerely, Rachel. Thank you so much, Rachel, for sharing all of that and for all the work you are doing in your district. That is absolutely incredible. You will find Rachel's Amazon wishlist down in that pinned comment below. Let's jump into the video. Now, every cult knows that capturing minds young is the surest way to sustain belief. American society, for all its talk of freedom, has long understood this as well. Public schooling in the United States has roots not only in education, but, in my opinion, indoctrination. The earliest state funded school systems were explicitly designed to instill obedience and social order among the masses. And while I also believe that it is very, very important for every single person to have an education, I do want to discuss further what the research says when it comes to the type of schooling that a lot of students are experiencing. Recent research in political science confirms that, quote, public primary schools were created by states to reinforce obedience among the masses and maintain social order rather than to serve as a tool for upward mobility. In fact, throughout history, periods of internal conflict and dissent have spurred elites to push new patriotic education initiatives aimed at the shoring up the status quo. From the Prussian model of compulsory schooling, which was admired by 19th century American reformers, to President Trump's short lived 1776 commission after the 2020 Black Lives Matter protests, those in power have viewed schooling as a means to suppress dissent and inculcate loyalty. Children, as one scholarly noted, are like sponges. They're very malleable and eager to absorb whatever lessons authority figures drill into them. So, the state mandates and daily routines and rituals like sitting still, marching in line from classroom to classroom, and following bell schedules are tools that have been used to internalize discipline. This conditioning begins as early as kindergarten. Now, I understand that children, especially kindergartners, are really, really difficult to keep under control. So I am not implying that I have some, secret ingredient to make the education system in America better. It is just interesting to kind of pull back the curtain and zoom out a little bit and look at all of this from a little bit more of a critical lens. Because by doing this to young people to get them to try to respect authority and revere national icons, the educational system is laying a foundation for lifelong, uncritical patriotism. And nothing illustrates this phenomenon better than the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, this was introduced in 1892, and it was literally a marketing gimmick written by a magazine editor to try to sell American flags to schools. But it tapped into a deep vein of nationalistic fervor. So, over the decades, the pledge became a daily fixture in classrooms nationwide, and people take it very seriously these days. Children as young as 5 would stand each morning and face the flag and chant in unison that loyalty oath to the flag: one nation with liberty and justice for all. And the recitation has an almost liturgical call and response quality, with teachers and government authority figures prompting their young flock to affirm faith in their nation. I remember when I was in school, thinking it was so weird to do this to the flag. And if you decided one day you just didn't want to do it, you would literally get in trouble. I remember getting reprimanded because I didn't stand up fast enough. Now, critics have not missed the resemblance to a totalitarian practice. And before you think I'm going too far, please just listen to this. One account dryly notes that pledges of allegiance are features of current and former totalitarian states such as Nazi Germany, unquote. Yeah. And indeed, the original pledge routine in the 1930s involved students extending their right arm in a stiff salute, a gesture that's so uncomfortably similar to the Nazi salute that it was later replaced with the hand over heart pose. So for decades, participation was effectively compulsory. It took a 1943 Supreme Court ruling, West Virginia versus Barnett, to affirm that Americans cannot be forced to salute the flag or recite the pledge, and that no government can, quote, prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion, unquote. Yet, in practice, social pressure and school policy still ensure that most students do participate. As of today, 47 U.S. states still require public schools to lead the pledge, though students may opt out if they dare draw attention to themselves by doing so. The content of the pledge, especially after 1954, further cements its cult like role. During the fervent religiosity of the Cold War, Congress inserted the words under God into the pledge to distinguish America from their godless communist regimes. The result is that each morning, public school teachers cue these children to proclaim the nation under God, blurring that line between civic and religious devotion. The notion that the United States is uniquely blessed by the Almighty is implanted at a very impressionable and young age. And this practice has been challenged as an unconstitutional mingling of church and state. But as I'm sure you know, courts have so far sidestepped or rejected such claims. But meanwhile, this daily practice continues. By sheer repetition, the ritual drives its message deep. Loyalty to the flag and the nation is not optional, but expected and unquestionable. As one observer put it, the pledge is, quote, an unnecessary and all too often empty bit of symbolism. Its purpose is indoctrination, unquote. Rote recitation encourages unthinking patriotism, a love of country performed out of habit and enforced conformity, rather than having arrived at that conclusion through critical reflection and really appreciating where you come from and where you live. The coercive element is not merely hypothetical, though. Students who refuse to stand or recite have frequently faced harassment or discipline despite their constitutional rights. In one case, a black high schooler in South Carolina, Marissa Barnwell, was berated and punished for quietly refusing to say the pledge, and this led to a lawsuit as recent as 2023. The pledge, in effect, operates as this daily loyalty test for young Americans. The majority pass with fervent murmurs, while the rare dissenter is singled out as disloyal. This dynamic is entirely consistent with cults, which demand a public show of fealty and stigmatize anyone who will not profess the approved creed. Now, educators do sometimes defend patriotic exercises by saying that they promote unity or civic virtue. But even some teachers question the value of a forced loyalty oath. In the words of two education scholars, quote, a forced recitation of the pledge lays the groundwork for a false and deeply shallow idea of patriotism, unquote. Coercing words of loyalty, they argue, runs contrary to true liberty. Notably, even Supreme Court justices have warned of this danger. In the Barnett decision that freed students from compulsory pledge recitation, quote, words uttered under coercion are proof of loyalty to nothing, unquote. Genuine patriotism, if it is to mean anything, must be voluntary and informed. Yet, the way we educate our youth often confuses conformity for loyalty. We drill these simplistic, feel good versions of American ideals into kids who are too young to grapple with the country's complexities. We wrap civic participation in quasi religious ceremony rather than reasoned inquiry. And in doing so, we produce citizens who equate patriotism with uncritical allegiance, which is fertile ground for demagogues and chauvinism. A revealing indicator of the pledge's indoctrinating power is how fiercely any criticism of it is resisted. When a federal appeals court ruled in 2002 that including under God in public school recitations was unconstitutional, the backlash was swift and monumental. Politicians from both parties denounced the ruling. The Senate voted 99-0 to condemn it, and congressmen gathered on the Capitol steps to thunderously recite the pledge in mass. In essence, the reaction confirmed the very point at issue. The pledge had become sacrosanct. To question it was tantamount to blasphemy against America's civil religion. That episode demonstrated that even elected leaders are not immune to the mindset of enforced orthodoxy. And the irony is rich. In the name of liberty and one nation under God, officials were ready to impose a mandatory declaration of belief. The cult like expectation of public piety had reached the halls of power. And in some, the American education system, through practices like the Pledge of Allegiance and a tightly controlled civic curriculum, functions as an indoctrination pipeline. It instills in each generation a base level of reverence for national symbols and a reluctance to question national narratives. Young Americans are, from the start, socialized into a civic cult, taught to confuse patriotism with conformity, and to see their nation through a gauzy lens of righteousness and divine favor. This childhood programming really sets the stage for other aspects, the myths about America, the symbols, and the intolerance of dissent that all took root in the American psyche. Now, a core strategy of cults is to rewrite history to flatter the group's self image and justify its dominance. And American civic culture has done exactly this through the teaching of sanitized, whitewashed history in our schools and public discourse. From elementary classrooms to Hollywood films, the story of America is too often presented as an unblemished saga of liberty and progress and heroism, conveniently glossing over or rationalizing the dark chapters of genocide, slavery, racism, and imperialism. The result is a national mythology that veers dangerously close to propaganda. It paints America as exceptional and benevolent by default, leaving citizens woefully uninformed about the oppressions and injustices woven into the country's fabric. As one historian bluntly observed, quote, the older history textbooks were like syringes that injected the toxin of white supremacy into the mind of many generations of Americans, unquote. That might be one of the strongest quotes to help visualize what has happened to society. I've never heard be said any better. But In other words, to kind of like water it down a little bit, what we have called history was often, in fact, indoctrination, a deliberate inoculation against the inconvenient truths about our nation. So consider what generations of American students learned or did not learn about the two monumental sins of our past: the dispossession of Native Americans and the enslavement of African Americans. These topics, if addressed at all, were long treated superficially and euphemistically in the school curricula. And honestly, those are only two examples. I know there are a lot of other examples of injustices done upon different groups of people, but this video would be like 5 hours long if I tried to cover everything. But if you want me to look more into certain things, please leave them down below in the comments because this was a rabbit hole and I will go down all of them for you. Now, textbooks for much of the 20th century virtually erased the true horrors of slavery, sometimes even portraying it as a benign institution. And astonishingly, as late as the 1920s through 40s, mainstream history textbooks taught that enslaved Black people were content and cared for, quote, from cradle to grave, unquote, under slavery, framing bondage as a, quote, natural environment for Africans. These books dismissed firsthand slave narratives as propaganda and totally ignored Black intellectual contributions. The false lost cause mythology, which romanticized Southern slave owners and downplayed the cruelties of bondage, took over American academia and public memory in the early 20th century. By mid century, many textbooks said hardly a word about slavery or depicted it with gross inaccuracies. One historian who reviewed his fifth grade textbook from the 1950s found that it said almost nothing about slavery and even got basic dates wrong. And this was not accidental. It reflected a conscious societal choice to de emphasize or justify past wrongs in order to foster uncritical patriotism. The genocide of Native Americans was similarly whitewashed. Standard history lessons traditionally celebrated westward expansion, like Manifest Destiny, as the fulfillment of America's noble mission, with only passing mention of the indigenous peoples who were killed or displaced in the process. School children learned about pilgrims and the friendly Indians at the first Thanksgiving, but not about the subsequent centuries of broken treaties, forced removals, and massacres. The Thanksgiving story itself was largely a fabrication designed to create a comforting fable of colonial indigenous harmony. As a Native American writer notes, during the Progressive Era, around 1900, educators explicitly crafted a, quote, sanitized story of Thanksgiving, a tale of pilgrims and Indians feasting in unity, omitting all the bloodshed and land theft that actually followed. And it was all in order to instill this national pride in waves of new immigrants. And by 1920, this idyllic Thanksgiving myth was taught to virtually every American school children, even in Native American schools, despite being a complete distortion of history. The true context that in 1637, the colonial Thanksgiving marked the massacre of a Pequot village, or that the Declaration of Independence decreed merciless Indian savages, was conveniently left out of the curriculum. Generations grew up believing a lie: that European colonization was fundamentally peaceful and mutually beneficial. But in reality, it was often genocidal. American popular culture reinforced this with Western movies depicting settlers as heroic and natives as either noble but doomed primitives or villainous aggressors. Only very recently have educators begun challenging the Thanksgiving myth and other facets of the frontier narrative as harmful fictions that drain the bloodshed from our past. Beyond these two pillars, slavery and native genocide, myriad other ugly episodes have been papered over. The theft of the Mexican lands in the 1846 to 48 war is rarely framed as aggression. The brutal conquest of the Philippines in 1899 through 1902 is seldom mentioned in school at all. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II is acknowledged but often minimized as a mistake in an otherwise just war. The long reign of Jim Crow apartheid in the South is truncated into a belief prelude to the triumphant civil rights movement without grappling with its persistent legacy. Textbooks have traditionally celebrated America's march of progress while glossing over the human cost. This tendency has been so pervasive that even today, many high school graduates arrive at college shocked by revelations of atrocities in American history that they were never taught. As an educator lamented, we're not teaching students the true American history because African American history is American history. Yet students report learning not much about slavery or Black contributions in school. The mechanisms of this whitewashing have been simultaneously subtle and blatant. On the subtle end, there's the skewed emphasis of curricula. History classes dwell lovingly on the founding fathers, the revolution, and the westward expansion, and America's rise as a world power. But they devote far less time to the oppressed people under America's boot heel. Often, the narrative is one of almost unbroken triumph. 13 colonies win freedom. They expand liberty westward, save the world in 2 world wars, and champion democracy against communism, etc., etc., etc. The march of progress is foregrounded, while inconvenient detours, like the fact that the founding fathers were white supremacists who owned slaves, are only mentioned in passing, if at all. By presenting history as a series of patriotic set pieces, schools are indoctrinating a kind of secular gospel of America. The implicit message: our nation, though imperfect, has always been a force for good. And this leaves little room to critically examine systemic evils like racism or settler colonialism. On the blatant end, there have been direct attempts to censor or even distort content. State boards of education, particularly in large states like Texas that influence national textbook markets, have pressured publishers to use euphemisms, like referring to enslaved persons as workers or the slave trade as the Atlantic Triangular Trade, and to highlight the positive aspects of slave life, if there are any. Now, in extreme cases, ideological textbooks go so far as to call enslaved people Black immigrants, as found in some right wing Christian school materials. A Guardian investigation revealed in 2021 that private Christian schools across the United States use textbooks that whitewash slavery and portray Native Americans as inferior, essentially teaching a racist version of history to hundreds of thousands of students. While public school texts are generally more balanced today, they still suffer from blind spots, and recent political backlashes only threaten to deepen the whitewashing. Dozens of states have, in the past few years, proposed or enacted laws restricting the teaching of what they consider divisive concepts like race and history, effectively forbidding teachers from discussing America's racist past in the most honest terms. Under the banner of fighting critical race theory, these measures seek to enforce this rosy portrayal of U.S. history by law. This is literally historical sanitation by mandate, an authoritarian impulse entirely at odds with scholarly history, but very much in line with the cultish denial of reality. The erasure and marginalization of Native American and African American experiences is especially telling. If American civic culture is a cult, then these groups' histories are the suppressed knowledge that the cult doesn't want followers to contemplate. For Native Americans, the erasure has been so complete that many Americans grow up scarcely aware that they still exist as real modern peoples. Native nations are often depicted as part of a distant bygone era, like wild Indians of the Old West, rather than contemporary communities who are still struggling with the ongoing effects of colonization. The average student might learn about the Trail of Tears or a few famous chiefs, but not about the full scope of ethnic cleansing and treaty betrayals that cleared the continent for white settlement. The narrative often implies that Native Americans simply faded away or were assimilated, rather than being actively dispossessed. And this fosters this kind of cultural amnesia. As one commentator noted after an exemplary K through 12 education in Iowa, he realized that there was, quote, shockingly little about Native Americans as primary subject matter, a gap that he only later recognized and sought to correct on his own. And these gaps are common. A national study in 2015 found that 87%, yep, you heard that right, 87% of state level U.S. history standards mention Native Americans only in the context of early colonial history, effectively ignoring the subsequent 200 plus years of Native experiences and U.S. Native relations. Indigenous perspectives were almost entirely missing from the narrative of American history taught in schools. African American history, while not entirely erased, has been truncated and decontextualized in mainstream teaching. Slavery is acknowledged, but often without conveying its true brutality or the central role it played in the nation's economy and politics. The long century of Jim Crow, racial terror, and disenfranchisement after the Civil War is hurried through on the way to a triumphant civil rights era that supposedly fixed racism. And the result is that many Americans, especially white Americans, have this impoverished understanding of how deeply racism is embedded in the country's story and kind of internalized in a lot of white European Americans. A 2018 report by the Southern Poverty Law Center found that schools nationwide were failing to teach the hard history of slavery, with 58% of teachers dissatisfied with their textbooks' coverage of the topic and students demonstrating serious misconceptions. For example, only 8% of 12th graders could identify slavery as the central cause of the Civil War. 8% of people who are about to go to college. That's just insane to me. By teaching Black history as a side quest rather than integral to the main narrative, curricula perpetuate the false idea that racial inequality is a deviation from the American story instead of a core component to it. All of this historical whitewashing serves the cult of American exceptionalism by constructing a civic mythology. And in this mythology, the United States is almost predestined for greatness, a nation chosen by providence and unbound by the corrupt past of older civilizations. From the beginning, Americans imagined themselves as a new chosen people. The novelist Herman Melville captures this in 1850 when he wrote, quote, "We Americans are the peculiar chosen people, the Israel of our time," unquote. Aggressive nationalists wielded this manifest destiny ideology to justify everything from removal of indigenous nations all the way to the war with Mexico. The idea that America has a divine mission and is inherently virtuous sank deep into the national psyche. It is the reason why so many people were shocked that Donald Trump got elected in 2016. I just want to say that because it is internalized, it has been ingrained. We are not fully aware of how much racism still exists. I think now we're way more aware of it, but 6 years ago, 8 years ago, I don't think we were fully conscious of it. We weren't totally aware. We didn't fully understand that we were victims to whitewashing. And in erasing that history, we've started to set the groundwork to potentially repeat it. I mean, America has been described as the last best hope of Earth and a shining city on a hill. Now, if a friend came to you and invited you to a group where they consider themselves to be the last hope on Earth, I bet you 100 times over you would be like, oh shit, my friend is in a cult. You would. Because these phrases, while sometimes they're sincere, they also function as articles of faith that discourage critical self examination. If we are God's chosen nation, how could our actions be fundamentally wrong? This is exactly the kind of cultic mentality that drives people in cults to hurt other people for their cult, totally ostracize themselves from their families for their cult, hurt themselves for their cult, or even kill for their cult. If we are the land of the free, how could we commit genocide or oppression? The mythos conveniently resolves these contradictions by omission or rationalization. And importantly, the propaganda of American foundational myths has been quite intentional. During periods of insecurity, such as the early 20th century influx of European immigrants, national leaders doubled down on promoting unified myths to try to Americanize the newcomers. And around this time, textbooks were carefully curated by committees, often dominated by conservative or Southern voices, to avoid any narratives that might cause students to question the nobility of the nation, especially if they were freshly immigrated here. The Texas State Board of Education, for example, has kind of pressured nationwide publishers to use language and emphasis that fit a very patriotic, Christian, and capitalist narrative. In recent years, this trend has in some ways intensified, with open attempts by politicians to enforce what they call patriotic education and attack curricula that highlight racism or inequality. These efforts, ostensibly against the indoctrination of what they call left wing ideas, are in fact a demand for indoctrination into the old nationalist orthodoxy. They reveal an anxiety among the powers that be that the cultic narrative may be losing its grip if students learn too much about the truth. And as a consequence of this, Americans have internalized this semi fictional story of our country's past, one where atrocities are either justified as unfortunate necessities or just erased entirely. And where the through line is one of relentless improvement and virtue. Now, this artificial narrative serves to bolster national self esteem and social cohesion, but it's at the cost of truth and accountability. And it functions very much like a cult doctrine, a simplified, glorified origin story that binds the group together and must be defended against heretical facts. From colonial times onward, those who challenged the comforting myths have met hostility. Frederick Douglass, in his scorching 1852 speech, quote, "What to the slave is the 4th of July," unquote, was effectively acting as an anti cult truth teller, exposing to Americans the hypocrisy of their freedom narrative in the face of slavery. His reward was to be dismissed by many white people at the time as an extremist. Now, in the 20th century, the first historians who rigorously documented the genocide of Native Americans or the extent of racist violence were often marginalized in academia or attacked by patriotic societies. Even in the 21st century, when journalists or scholars foreground America's historical crimes, they face backlash. I'm sure you'll see some angry comments in this very video, especially considering it's Independence Day weekend. We have to consider the New York Times 1619 Project, which dared to center slavery in the national story and was then lambasted by many politicians who demanded more celebratory history instead. Yet, cracks in this facade are starting to show. Thanks to the civil rights movements, scholarship, and activism by descendants of the oppressed, the false history is being challenged. For instance, it's increasingly recognized that the true story of America cannot be told without Native and African American voices front and center. The American narrative is being rewritten in some quarters to include the perspectives of those who were systematically excluded from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To the extent this honest reappraisal gains ground, it undermines the cult like blind worship of national myth. That is precisely why forces who benefit from the myth redouble efforts to squash these changes. The struggle over history education in America today, the fights over banning books about race, the panic legislation to protect patriotic instruction, it's all essentially a struggle over whether Americans will continue to live within a cult of national myth or step outside of it and into reality. Now, if you walk into any American public event, whether it's a sports game, a political rally, or a school assembly, you are likely to encounter a familiar ceremony. A hush falls over the crowd. Men remove their caps, and all eyes turn to the ubiquitous American flag as the opening notes of the Star Spangled Banner echo. Thousands of voices rise in unison to sing of bombs bursting in the air and a banner still waving. In that moment, there's an almost palpable sense of solemn reverence. For an instant, differences among the crowd are forgotten in a collective expression of devotion to the nation's emblem. And the scene is so routine that few even pause to consider its strangeness. But imagine describing it to an anthropologist from another world. Huge gatherings of people are singing hymns to a striped cloth and professing loyalty to it. The anthropologist or even cult expert might easily label this behavior as, yeah, it's culty, a form of worship directed at a sacred symbol. And indeed, historians have a term for it: the cult of the flag. They trace its roots to the American Civil War, after which the United States flag became imbued with quasi religious significance. When the flag came down at Fort Sumter, it went up everywhere in the North almost like magic, one historian notes. This was the beginning of what historians called the cult of the flag, an almost religious feeling that Americans have for the stars and the stripes. Unquote. Over the ensuing decades, that reverence only deepened, turning the flag into arguably the most venerated secular icon on the planet. The American flag today occupies a place in civic life akin to the cross in Christianity or the Kaaba in Islam. It is displayed in classrooms, courtrooms, churches, front porches, and yes, flying high over every government building and car dealership. It's treated with elaborate ritual deference. There's a flag code dictating its handling, like never let it touch the ground, never fly it below any other flag, and you must illuminate it at night. And there are other laws, though legally unenforceable, against desecrating it. Burning or vandalizing a flag, while constitutionally protected as free speech, is widely seen as an unforgivable taboo, an act so inflammatory that it reliably provokes outrage and sometimes violence. This sanctity resembles the way religious communities treat their holy objects. In a sense, the American flag has been consecrated in the civil religion of the United States. Citizens pledge allegiance to it. Soldiers plant it on conquered territory. Astronauts famously staked it on the moon. It drapes the coffins of national heroes. When Americans die in terror attacks or foreign wars, memorial shrines often display countless little flags as symbols of communal mourning and resolve. Patriotic rituals and holidays reinforce this sacralization. Take Flag Day, June 14th, a national observance dedicated solely to honoring the Stars and Stripes, or the ubiquitous practice of singing the national anthem before sporting events. It's a tradition that accelerated after World War II and especially post 9/11 until it became virtually mandatory even at high school games. By one account, the anthem has been performed at every single Major League Baseball game since 1942. No other country's sports culture does this on such a routine basis. It is effectively a ritual prayer to the nation before playing begins. The ceremony often, too, features dramatic displays. Giant flags covering entire fields with dozens of people reverently unfurling and holding them, military honor guards presenting the colors, and even military flyovers with fighter jets screaming overhead at the song's climax. These patriotic skepticals are explicitly designed to stir the soul. Amy Barnett, who manages a company renting out enormous flags for events, describes the emotional impact as even watching it on TV, I still get tears in my eyes and a lump in my throat. I love the patrioticness of it. The crowd loves it so much. It's amazing. And such responses are not unusual. Many Americans report feeling choked up during the anthem or other flag ceremonies. And this is the intended effect, a kind of collective euphoria and unity, what Emil Durkheim would call collective effervescence, normally associated with religious worship. And it's worth noting that some of these stadium extravaganzas have been orchestrated from above. In the 2010s, a scandal emerged revealing that the Pentagon had paid professional sports leagues millions of dollars to stage ostentatious patriotic tributes. Troops on the field, surprise soldier homecomings, giant flag displays as recruiting and PR tools. Between 2011 and 2015, the Department of Defense spent more than $10 million on contracts with teams across the NFL, NBA, MLB, and others for these so-called paid patriotism events. Taxpayers, in other words, were unknowingly funding what appeared to be spontaneous eruptions of patriotism. Senators John McCain and Jeff Flake, who exposed this practice, criticized it for commercializing and manipulating sincere sentiment. After scrutiny, the NFL and DoD ostensibly halted paid ceremonies, yet the culture of elaborate displays persists. Even without direct payments, teams now continue such rituals out of tradition or out of fear of appearing unpatriotic if they do stop. But the effect is the same. Sports arenas have become temples of militaristic patriotism, where fans are prompted to cheer not just for the team, but for the nation and its warriors. The worshipful treatment of the military in American culture goes hand in hand with flag veneration. In recent decades, especially, there has arisen a near deification of soldiers as heroes beyond reproach. At many public events, a moment is set aside to honor all the men and women serving our country, often met with standing ovations. And ironically, these veterans are often not supported financially or mentally or just lifestyle wise by the government. Like, thank you so much for shouting me out, but I need some therapy and I need to find a job, and you put my body and my mind through trauma. Please help. Now, I'm a little bit passionate about this because it breaks my heart that someone would be drafted to go do something. So, not of their own accord sometimes, drafted to go to war, see and experience and do things that they would never voluntarily want to do, and come home with so much mental and physical pain that it's hard for them to function back in society. It's, to me, utterly heartbreaking. But commercials, stadium, jumbotrons, and TV programs constantly implore us to thank the troops for their service. Airports sometimes even invite travelers to applaud service members while they move through the terminal. And this sentiment, yes, it's kind on the surface, but the sheer ubiquity suggests something deeper. A societal expectation of military veneration that brooks no dissent. The idea of the soldier as a saint is rarely questioned in mainstream discourse. Political candidates compete to display fealty to the troops, support our troops' magnets, adorn countless cars, and those who even hint at criticism of the military as an institution itself risk furious backlash. The fate of football player Colin Kaepernick is instructive. When he knelt during the national anthem to protest racial injustice, explicitly saying that he meant no disrespect to the troops, only to draw attention to police brutality, he was nonetheless derided as unpatriotic and essentially blackballed from the NFL. In the court of public opinion, especially among young conservative, older, or white Americans, failing to show proper deference to the flag or the military is considered to be a grievous sin. Kaepernick's peaceful act during the anthem was viewed by NFL owners as such a threat that no team would ever hire him again. So the message became very clear: toe the patriotic line or face exile. And this reflects how, in a cult like nationalistic environment, dissent during rituals isn't tolerated. The ritual itself is sacrosanct, and to disrupt it with protest, however mild, is to desecrate that holy moment. Now, how did militarism and nationalism become so conflated in American civic rituals? Well, one can trace it back at least to World War II and the Cold War, when the US cast itself as the leader of the free world and the armed forces as guardians of liberty. The cultural script was set. The military defends our freedoms. Therefore, honoring the military equals honoring freedom itself. So over time, this hardened into a sort of article of faith. After the trauma of 9/11 and through the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Americans were urged more than ever to idolize the troops, even as those wars became controversial. The disconnect between professed reverence and actual care, like providing veterans with health care, is very notable. But what matters now for our discussion is the symbolic role. The troops serve as living symbols of the nation's power and virtue. So to worship them is to worship the nation. The fusion of church, state, and soldier was vividly on display during the January 6, 2021 Capitol riot, when Christian banners, American flags, and Jesus Saves signs were all jumbled together with military slogans and political chants. It was a potent stew of God and country fervor. Sociologists refer to this phenomenon as American civil religion, a set of sacred beliefs, symbols, and rituals that parallel traditional religion but are centered on the nation. The flag is the totem. The founding documents and Gettysburg Address are the sacred scriptures. National holidays are holy days, and revered leaders like Washington and Lincoln are saints or martyrs. War memorials serve as shrines. Patriotic songs are hymns. Consider Memorial Day and Veterans Day, holidays which have assumed an almost liturgical character. We're encouraged to not simply barbecue, but to solemnly remember the fallen, those who sacrificed for our freedom. And this language intentionally echoes religious sacrifice. There is a strong motif of martyrdom. Soldiers die for the salvation of the nation's ideals, just as saints die for their faith. Little wonder that war memorials often resemble temples. The Lincoln Memorial comes to mind because it quite literally has the form of a Greek temple enshrining the martyr president in marble glory. One striking example of civil religious ritual is the funeral of a prominent statesman or military figure. It often involves the flag being draped around the coffin and lying in a state as if on an altar, with honor guards standing vigil, and a 21-gun salute, which is a salute with very ancient martial origins, and the folding of the flag to be handed to the next of kin on behalf of a grateful nation. And the phrasing is telling. It personifies the nation as an entity that must express eternal gratitude to its servants. It casts the fallen in a Christ-like role. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends, unquote. It's a verse that's so frequently invoked in military eulogies. At times, this civil religion even borrows explicitly from scripture. Phrases like one nation under God, or mottos like in God we trust and God bless America, reinforce the idea that patriotism and piety are intertwined. All of these symbols and rituals serve to create an emotional, almost spiritual attachment to the nation. They bypass critical thought and go straight to the heart. In the swelling of pride during a flyover, the tear in the eye during a patriotic song, the lump in the throat at the sight of the flag after some tragedy. It is not that other nations lack patriotism or symbols. It's that in America, these have been elevated to an especially intense plane. Foreign observers have often remarked on it. In many European countries, for instance, the national anthem is reserved for international sports or formal state occasions, not every local match. The profusion of flags on private homes is far less. The adulation of the military is more restrained. The American brand of patriotism is more ritualistic and all pervasive, which is why it's fair to call it cult like. It's like a low level worship that the average citizen is expected to partake in constantly. And like a cult, it uses spectacle and repetition to cement loyalty. There is an argument that this civil religion helped hold a vast, diverse nation together. And that may be partially true. Shared symbols can build social cohesion. But the dark side is how these symbols and rituals are used to enforce conformity and silence dissent. When patriotism is measured by how eagerly one salutes the flag or applauds the troops, then anyone who chooses a different expression of loyalty, perhaps by protesting injustice as Copernic did, they're condemned as a traitor. The symbol becomes more important than the principles it supposedly stands for. The flag is said to represent freedom. Yet, if someone freely decides not to venerate the flag, many Americans would strip them of freedom in punishment. So, this is a classic trap of having any kind of real idol. The symbol overtakes the substance. Loving the country comes to mean performing the approved rituals, not working to ensure the country lives up to its ideals. One dramatic illustration of this inversion came in early 2003 during the fevered run up to the Iraq War. The Dixie Chicks, a popular country music trio, casually remarked at a London concert that they opposed the war and were ashamed of President George W. Bush. They were ashamed that he was from Texas. And that backlash was instant and vicious. Country radio stations organized boycotts of their music. Fans burned and bulldozed their CDs in public demonstrations. The group received death threats. Their hit song plummeted off the charts as DJs refused to play it. And in one telling incident, a tractor was used to crush Dixie Chicks CDs in Louisiana as a crowd cheered. So the message was clear. Criticizing the president during wartime, even exercising your free speech to question a war, was un-American and blasphemous. And in a cult, those who question the leader or the dogma are cast out. Here, those country singers were effectively excommunicated from their musical community. The irony that they were punished in the name of patriotism, a concept presumably including free speech, was totally lost on the mob. Across the country, similar incidents occurred. In one case, a man in New York was literally arrested for wearing an anti-war t-shirt at a mall. An official in Pennsylvania who passed an anti-war resolution was hounded out of office and told to leave town as a traitor. A senior Bush administration advisor labeled a critical journalist the closest thing American journalism has to a terrorist. All of this in supposed defense of American values. But it really vividly demonstrates how ritualized patriotism can morph into an engine of oppression. When the nation is regarded as infallible and sacred, then disagreement becomes heresy. American society's reverence for symbolic patriotism, the flags, the anthems, and the uniforms, has also provided a handy cloak for dubious policies. Politicians routinely wrap themselves in the flag, sometimes literally with their little American flag pins on all of their blazers. But posturing as defenders of the sacred symbols, they deflect scrutiny from what they actually do. A terrible policy can garner support if it's sold as supporting our troops or protecting the flag or defending freedom. The Iraq War itself was packaged as a response to 9/11 under a flurry of flags and patriotic rhetoric, and those who questioned it were branded unpatriotic. In 2007, when some activists pushed to withdraw U.S. forces, President Bush insinuated that critics didn't support the troops, conflating opposition to a war with betrayal of the nation. This rhetorical tactic works because the emotional power of the symbols short circuits rational debate. Once people are in their emotional flag waving mode, they are less likely to listen to nuance or dissent. In recent years, even as divisions in American society have grown, the cult of symbols remains potent. The difference is that each side accuses the other side of defiling the symbols. The right claims the left hates America because some left activists burn flags or question the national narrative, and the left points out that on January 6th, insurrectionists beat police officers with flagpoles and defecated in the Capitol while shouting slogans about patriotism, thus perverting the flag they carried. I mean, it's all extremism in the name of patriotism, and it is dangerous. But few people actually take a step back to question the overarching premise that our national symbols should be objects of near religious devotion in the first place. Outside the cult mindset, one might say a flag is a piece of cloth. True patriotism is measured by deeds, not by how reverently one treats a colored fabric. But within the civic cult, that very thought is almost blasphemy. Now, if the classroom is where Americans are first indoctrinated and patriotic ritual is how they express that indoctrination, then mass media is the echo chamber that continuously reinforces the cult narrative. From Hollywood's war movies and action flicks to cable news broadcasts and even advertising, Americans are bombarded with messaging that celebrates the nation's virtues, trivializes its wrongs, and marginalizes dissenting or complex viewpoints. This pervasive propaganda doesn't always feel like propaganda. It often comes packaged as entertainment or common sense commentary, but its cumulative effect is powerful. Over decades, it has cultivated a populace that often conflates the American dream with reality, that believes that the U.S. is inherently a force of good in this world, and that is conditioned to reflexively distrust any critique of American motives. In other words, we live in a carefully constructive narrative environment, a kind of immersive theater that keeps the cult of America going strong. And Hollywood, perhaps more than any other institution, has been a myth maker for the American cult. A recent investigation found that the Pentagon and the CIA have had direct involvement in over 2,500 films and TV shows, exerting editorial control in many cases. So just think about it. Thousands of pieces of popular media have been quietly shaped to bolster the image of American institutions. And this far outstrips anything the old Soviet or Nazi propaganda ministries achieved in terms of global reach. And unlike obvious propaganda, Hollywood's product is entertaining and emotionally resonant, making it far more effective. A well crafted war movie or superhero saga can instill patriotic assumptions without the viewer even realizing it. We cheer when Captain America single handedly defeats villainous Nazis, Hydra agents, or aliens, reinforcing the notion that American might, and by extension, U.S. foreign policy, is heroic and necessary to save the world. We tear up when the Marine in Saving Private Ryan sacrifices himself for his brothers, reaffirming the almost spiritual honor of American soldiering. We feel righteous anger watching Argo or Zero Dark 30, where CIA agents are depicted as patriots protecting innocents, even though in real life the CIA has done quite sinister things. By giving these agencies and military branches heroic narratives, Hollywood helps inoculate the public against critically questioning them. Even beyond overt military themes, subtler forms of propaganda abound in the American media. The news media, for instance, often exhibit a nationalistic bias. Major U.S. news outlets, especially television news, typically frame international events from an American perspective, implicitly assuming that U.S. motives are good and adversaries' motives are suspect. During wartime, mainstream media have repeatedly acted as cheerleaders for war rather than skeptical investigators. In the run up to the 2003 Iraq invasion, most TV networks uncritically parroted the government's false claims about weapons of mass destruction, draping their graphics in flags and coming back from commercial breaks with patriotic music. And dissenting voices were few and often marginalized. Phil Donahue, an MSNBC host who was openly against the Iraq War, was famously fired in early 2003 despite having good ratings. A leaked memo suggested that the network didn't want a, quote, difficult public face, unquote, who challenged the patriotic fervor. Newspapers like the New York Times later apologized for not being more critical in their reporting. But by then, the war was well underway, sold to the public like a product via wall to wall propaganda. The pattern is old. During World War I, the U.S. government had a propaganda ministry called the Creel Committee that pumped out war hype and demonized Germany, and newspapers enthusiastically complied. By World War II, Hollywood joined in with war-glorifying films and cartoons. During the Cold War, media often amplified fears of the communist menace, sometimes aiding government disinformation. For example, in the 80s, news outlets credulously spread the Reagan administration's line about Central American conflicts, portraying leftist rebels as Soviet pawns and downplaying the atrocities by US backed regimes. And in the post 9/11 era, a sort of unquestionable worship of the military became the norm on TV news, as one analyst did observe. Criticizing the wars or tactics was framed as disloyal to those troops. This created an environment where meaningful debate was totally stifled. The cult narrative, America is fighting against evil, you need to support the war, totally drowned out the nuance. Propaganda in American media also extends to domestic issues, notably the economy and the American dream ideology. For decades, political discourse and business journalism have relentlessly promoted the idea that the free market capitalist system is sacrosanct and synonymous with Americanism. Alternatives like stronger social safety nets, wealth redistribution, public enterprise are dismissed as socialism or un American. And this is effectively economic propaganda that has elevated capitalism to a quasi religion. We are told from a young age that anyone can make it if they work harder. This is also called the Horatio Alger myth, and that wealth will always flow to the deserving. Popular culture reinforces this with countless rags to riches stories, reality TV shows about entrepreneurs, and adulation of billionaires as visionary saviors. The result is a population that, even as it suffers from high inequality, often believes that this system is fair and failure is actually a personal fault. The myth of the American dream, that through grit one can rise from nothing to success, is deeply ingrained. Yet, statistically, the US has lower social mobility than many other wealthy nations. Research shows that, quote, the United States has far less mobility and equality of opportunity today than almost the entire European Union, unquote. For example, only 8% of Americans born in the poorest fifth managed to climb to the richest fifth versus about 15% in Denmark. In other words, the American dream is often just that, a dream, more attainable in other countries than in the US itself. But the power of propaganda keeps this reality obscured. And if you're a millennial like me and kind of felt like you were under this spell, it's very, very disillusioning and dissatisfying and brings in a lot of sadness. I mean, people wonder why there's so much anxiety and depression among millennials, and it's like because we were constantly told we could achieve greatness no matter what, and it's so incredibly difficult to do that. Now, if you've been watching this channel for a long time, you know that No cult tolerates heresy. Those who question the dogma or defy the leaders are typically subjected to shaming, ostracism, or worse. The American national cult, for all its claims to love liberty, has exhibited a similar reflex. Dissent is often met with punishment, and whistleblowers who expose uncomfortable truths are treated as traitors. Across eras, the United States has a long history of persecuting those who challenge its dominant narratives or power structures. This is deeply paradoxical in a country whose founding documents enshrine freedom of speech and dissent as patriotic duties, yet is explicable when seen through the lens of maintaining the cult's cohesion. A cult cannot afford apostates who might sway others with inconvenient facts. Thus, certain mechanisms emerge, both legal and social, to try to marginalize or destroy dissidents' credibility and lives. So let's just take a moment to examine America's treatment of its dissident and truth tellers. A vivid early example comes from World War I, when the U.S. government, under President Woodrow Wilson, passed the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, draconian laws that criminalized criticisms of the war effort. Simply distributing anti war pamphlets or even questioning military conscription could land you in prison. And many were indeed imprisoned, including the socialist leader Eugene V. Debs, who was sentenced to 10 years for a mild anti war speech. These laws created an atmosphere in which dissent was equated with disloyalty, a clear hallmark of the cult mindset. And the message: if you're not with us, you're against us. And the Supreme Court at the time shamefully upheld these convictions. The infamous falsely shouting fire in a theater line comes from a case about an anti war pamphleteer. While those acts were later repealed or expired, the Espionage Act in particular has remained and become the government's hammer of choice against whistleblowers more than a century later. Originally meant to punish spies, it's been twisted to prosecute truth tellers who leak information to the American public when that information embarrasses the government. Fast forward to the post 9/11 era, and one sees a surge in efforts to quash dissent. In the early 2000s, opposition to the Iraq War was not illegal, but it was demonized. Peaceful protesters were corralled into free speech zones far from TV cameras. The Patriot Act and expanded surveillance allowed federal agencies to monitor and harass anti war groups under the guise of counterterrorism. Muslim Americans, in particular, had their charities shut down and lives upended on flimsy accusations of disloyalty. The atmosphere was such that wearing a shirt that said "No War for Oil" got one man arrested for trespassing. In countless everyday conversations and workplaces, then, those against the war kept their heads down for fear of social retaliation. And the chilling effect of this was real. People got the message that speaking out carried consequences. Perhaps the most striking pattern has been the criminal prosecution of whistleblowers who reveal state misconduct. President Obama's administration, despite its liberal reputation, became notorious for its war on whistleblowers, using the 1917 Espionage Act to charge more leakers than all previous presidents combined. At least 8 government employees were indicted under the Espionage Act during Obama's tenure for leaking information of public interest. These included NSA employee Thomas Drake, who exposed waste and surveillance abuses, State Department analyst Stephen Kim, who spoke about North Korea's nuclear intentions, Army intelligence analyst Chelsea Manning, who released evidence of war crimes and diplomatic deceit, and CIA officer John Kiriakou, who confirmed the CIA's torture program. While actual spies who sold secrets to foreign powers were relatively rare, people who acted as whistleblowers to inform their fellow citizens were aggressively pursued. The Espionage Act, as applied to them, denied them the ability to even argue that they were acting in public interest. It treats motive as irrelevant. And this is telling. In the cult of national security, intent to inform the public is no defense because the cult's rule is that the secrets must remain secret, and the cult alone defines the truth. The Obama DOJ's zeal was unprecedented, more than double those under all previous presidents combined, as noted by The Guardian, and it sent a clear signal to would-be whistleblowers. Speak out, and we will ruin you. Another aspect of punishing dissent is surveillance and infiltration of dissident groups. During the 60s and 70s, the FBI's COINTELPRO actively spied on, disrupted, and discredited civil rights groups, anti-war organizations, and others deemed subversive. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. were harassed. The FBI sent him a letter urging him to unalive himself under the direction of J. Edgar Hoover. The Black Panthers were infiltrated and targeted in lethal raids. So, obviously, the intent was to destroy movements from within, sow paranoia, and criminalize protest. Essentially, the state treated legitimate domestic dissent as an enemy to be neutralized, exactly the approach a cult takes to defectors or critics. This continues in various forms after 9/11. Peace groups and even Quaker meetings were monitored by law enforcement under the absurd justification of counterterrorism. In recent years, environmental and racial justice activists have found themselves surveilled or on watch lists. The clear through line is that when citizens gather to demand changes that challenge powerful interests or national myths, they become targets for intimidation. Critics are also punished by exclusion from mainstream platforms and debates. One glaring example, voices that opposed the Iraq invasion in 2003 were notably scarce on Sunday talk shows or op-ed pages in the lead-up. Phil Donahue's anti-war talk show was canceled weeks before the war. It later emerged that across major TV networks, out of hundreds of commentators on the war in the early days, only a handful were skeptics. The ratio was something like 25 pro-war voices for every anti-war one. This isn't an accident. Producers consciously or unconsciously avoided booking unpatriotic guests. Thus, the public watching at home got the false impression of consensus and felt pressure to get in line. Only much later did media retrospectives lament, "We were too hard on dissenters. We should have listened more." But by then, the damage was done. Over and over, the cycle repeats. Early dissent is ridiculed or punished, and years later, once the official policy fails or is discredited by events, people retroactively acknowledge the dissenters, well, they had a point. But rarely are there institutional reforms to better include dissent next time. Why? Because the cult mentality reasserts itself. In moments of decision, questioning voices are seen as a liability to unity. The punishment of whistleblowers has another chilling consequence. It fosters a climate of fearful obedience within institutions, just like every other traditional cult does. And it's important to highlight that not all dissent is punished equally. It depends on the content and whom it threatens. For instance, far-right dissent, like armed anti-government extremists, is sometimes handled with kid gloves or even tacit support when it doesn't challenge core national myths. Meanwhile, left-wing dissent, anti-war, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, historically faces more suppression because it directly challenges power hierarchies and national self-image. Even within media, a pundit can call the sitting U.S. president an idiot or denounce government incompetence, and that's fine. But if they say the U.S. as a whole has systemic blood on its hands or that capitalism is fundamentally flawed, they'll be marginalized real quick. Thus, permissible dissent stays within certain bounds. One can argue how to pursue America's interests, but questioning the interests or narrative themselves is often taboo. And this phenomenon was evident in the reactions to kneeling NFL players beyond Kaepernick as well. When a wave of players joined him in kneeling in 2017, they faced boos from the crowds, threats from sponsors, and the President of the United States calling them SOBs who should be fired. The immense pressure led many to stop protesting or never even start. The NFL eventually implemented a policy requiring players to stand for the anthem or stay off the field. And the chilling effect was achieved. By raising the stakes, your career versus your conscience, most players understandably chose their career. It goes to show that even without formal law, social and economic punishments enforce conformity. The cult doesn't need to jail everyone, but it can often bully them into silence. In academia, too, those who write too bluntly about U.S. foreign policy or racism can find themselves attacked. Now, to sum it all up, the United States, despite its formal freedoms, exhibits a consistent pattern of punishing those who defy its dominant narratives or expose its misdeeds. Whether through legal prosecution, professional destruction, or public vilification, the message is sent: dissent at your peril. This fosters conformity and silence, the lifeblood of any cult. It also engenders a climate of hypocrisy and fear. People learn to self censor, to nod along with patriotic platitudes, even if they privately have reservations, because they've seen what happens to those who speak out. Over time, this can create a populace that is outwardly very unified in its patriotic fervor because the dissenters have been muted or driven out of sight, further feeding this illusion that the cult's doctrine is unanimously accepted truth. It's worth noting that often it is the dissents who truly love American ideals. They protest wars because they value human life, or leak truths because they believe in democratic accountability, or they kneel because they believe the country can do better by its people. Yet, in this cultish framework, their love is twisted to look like hate, and the real cynics, those who exploit blind patriotism for unjust ends, present themselves as the true patriots. This is why shining a light on these sometimes subtle but other times not so subtle acts of suppression is really important. It reveals the insecurity and authoritarian underbelly of the American civic religion. A confident nation wouldn't fear a football player's silent plea for justice, or a private's evidence of war crimes, or a protester's sign. The American cult of nationalism, for all its chest thumping about being the freest country, paradoxically cannot tolerate a free marketplace of ideas about itself. It must rig the game, punish heresy, and enforce orthodoxy, lest the people start questioning and the whole belief system unravels. Breaking a cult's spell is not easy, but it is possible, and it may be essential for American democracy to survive and thrive. For America, a reckoning might be needed. We must, as a society, replace mythology with history, replace sanctimony with humility, and replace performative patriotism with reflective patriotism. A reflective patriotism is one that says, I love my country enough to see it clearly, warts and all, and to help it improve. It's a patriotism closer to James Baldwin's sentiment. I love America more than any other country in the world, and exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. But in order to get there, Americans will have to do what cult members find the hardest: admit that they were misled. And that doesn't mean everything taught was a lie or that there is nothing to be proud of. It means that we must discard the toxic notion that acknowledging flaws is disloyal. True loyalty, after all, involves holding the beloved to higher standards. Consider the Pledge of Allegiance. One could imagine an evolved civic ritual that doesn't require a daily oath, but perhaps a periodic reflection on civic responsibilities or a pledge to the Constitution and its ideals rather than a flag. Or consider history education. It can incorporate the perspectives of the enslaved, the dispossessed, the dissenter, not to shame students, but to empower them with truth and empathy, making them better citizens and people. A citizenry that knows its country's failings is less likely to repeat them and more likely to extend justice where it was previously denied. In a way, it's the difference between worshiping an idol versus practicing a faith. The cult encourages idol worship of America. A healthier civic culture would encourage faith in American principles, a faith that is not blind, but active and accountable. The battle between cultism and democracy in America is growing. We see it in fights over media truthfulness, over whether to hold powerful people accountable for lying. We see it in the face off between those who want religious dogma to dictate laws and those who uphold pluralism. We see it in the tension between security agencies wanting secrecy and whistleblowers and press advocating for transparency. Perhaps the most crucial element to dismantling the cult is to protect and listen to the heretics, those who speak up. Whistleblowers should be honored, not jailed. Peaceful protesters should be heard, not vilified. Minority viewpoints should get a fair platform. The free exchange of ideas, the lifeblood of a democracy, is fatal to a cult because it dilutes the cult's monopoly on the narrative. That's why our Constitution's First Amendment is so important. It's literally an anti cult provision, forbidding the government from establishing an official dogma or from punishing speech. When we uphold it, we have tools to challenge the false narratives. When we circumvent it, we edge back towards cult enforcement. It's also vital to recognize that patriotism and nationalism are not binary. It's not a choice between uncritical love or outright hate. There is a middle ground, informed patriotism. Think of it like loving a family member who has serious problems. You don't love them by denying their problems or enabling those problems. You love them by helping them to confront and overcome those problems. An informed patriot loves America enough to want it to live up to its promise. The cultic patriot says America is perfect by default. The informed patriot says America becomes greater by aspiring to perfection and correcting its course. Ultimately, breaking the spell of the cult of America might lead us to a place where we can still celebrate the 4th of July with fireworks and songs, but also remember on Juneteenth the end of slavery with equal fervor, where we can stand for the national anthem if we choose, but also respect the teammate who kneels out of conscience, where we can honor veterans' sacrifice, not by glorifying war or silencing anti war voices, but instead by committing to only send soldiers into just and necessary conflicts. It would be a society where dissent is not seen as a blemish, but as an integral part of the national immune system, the highest form of patriotism. In such a society, one could imagine no leader ever again saying, "You're either with us or against us," in the face of complex issues, and no child feeling forced to say words they don't understand to prove their loyalty. Breaking from a cult is often a painful and isolating process for individuals. They may feel lost without the old certainties. And similarly, as a nation, letting go of comforting myths may initially feel disorienting or divisive, but the reward is authenticity and growth. Americans can build a patriotism that is robust and based in reality, one that doesn't require demonizing others or wearing blinders. Imagine an America where liberty and justice for all is not just a ritual incantation, but a real policy agenda, where the flag is not an idol, but a reminder of the freedoms it's meant to symbolize, where our military is respected for protecting the nation, but not worshipped as an oracle, where history classes inspire students with the full, complicated truth, heroes and villains, triumphs and tragedies, so that they can appreciate the real moral story of America. That we have achieved great things, not by pretending we're perfect, but by recognizing where we were not and striving to do better. Such a national self image would be humbler, yes, but also healthier and more resilient. It would bind us not in a cult of false unity, but in a community of shared commitment to ideals. The alternative, clinging to the cult, well, it runs the risk that reality will eventually shatter the illusion in more violent ways. A nation that cannot face its flaws is doomed to repeat them, perhaps until a breaking point. We see hints of that in the turmoil of recent years. So, to avoid greater fractures, the cult must be peacefully dismantled from within by we, the people, using our voices, our votes, and our values. I hope you are all having a very, very fun and safe 4th of July weekend. I hope that this video, even if it made you feel a little angry at first, I hope that it brought an open-mindedness to you. I hope that it educated you a little bit. I hope that it inspired action within you. Maybe even if it's on a smaller scale, a smaller scope. How can we advocate for each other better? How can we treat each other better? It's so hard when we are kind of in this very divisive time where people are on like one of two spectrums. There's not really room for nuance or meeting in the middle. But at some point, we do have to, because this exploration of America being like the biggest cult in the world has really shown me that it's so much about understanding other people's experiences, not hiding or diminishing those experiences or judging people's reaction to those experiences. So, whatever you're doing this 4th of July weekend, I hope that you are happy. I hope that you are staying safe with those fireworks, staying safe in general. And thank you guys all so much for your support. And remember, always ask questions, speak up when you need to, and always stay skeptical. Thank you so much for watching today, and I will see you in my next video very soon. Bye.